The morning Nora Callahan arrived in Dusthaven, New Mexico Territory. The year was 1878, and she had exactly $4.32 to her name, a battered carpetbag, and a dead husband's debts trailing behind her like a shadow she could not outrun. She stepped off the stagecoach into the blinding September sun and stood in the middle of the main street while dust swirled around her boots, and a pair of mules watched her with magnificent indifference from across the road. The town was rougher than she had imagined. Rougher and smaller, and somehow louder, with the clang of a blacksmith's hammer competing against the tinny notes of a piano leaking from a saloon called the Silver Spur. She pressed her carpetbag to her chest and reminded herself that she had come here for a reason. She had come here to start over, and that was what she intended to do, even if the starting over looked considerably less promising than she had hoped. Nora was 26 years old. Her husband, Patrick Callahan, had died of a fever 7 months ago in Kansas City, leaving behind not only her grief, but a string of gambling debts she had discovered tucked into the false bottom of his traveling trunk. The men he owed had come calling within a week of the funeral, and she had understood then that Kansas City held nothing for her anymore. She had sold everything she could sell, paid what she could pay, and boarded the first westbound stage she could afford, choosing Dusthaven from a territorial map pinned to the wall of the station house simply because the name sounded like a place that might be accustomed to burying the past. She needed work. She was an excellent cook, a capable seamstress, and she could keep books with a precision that would have surprised most men of her acquaintance. She pulled her shawl tighter against the October wind that was beginning to sharpen along the edges of the afternoon and walked toward the only establishment that appeared to offer lodging, a narrow 2-story building with a painted sign that read Alvarez Boarding House, clean rooms, fair rates. She was 3 steps from the door when she collided, almost bodily, with a man coming out of it. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed. Tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a duster the color of charcoal, with dark eyes that caught the light in a way she could not immediately explain. He reached out a steadying hand and caught her by the elbow before she could stumble backward into the street, and the grip was firm but careful. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not waste words. "No, it was entirely my fault," she said, stepping back once he released her. "I wasn't watching." He studied her for a moment. Not in the way that some men looked at women who arrived alone in western towns, with that calculating appraisal that made her skin crawl. It was more like he was trying to place her, as though she fit a description he had been given and he was checking the details. "You just come in on the stage?" he asked. "I did." "You got family here? Someone meeting you?" She lifted her chin just slightly. "I don't believe that's any concern of yours." One corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile but close enough to qualify. "No offense intended, ma'am. I'm Jedediah Mercer. I own the Mercer Ranch about 4 miles east of town. I was looking for somebody to take on a particular job, and you have the look of someone who just arrived in need of one." She stared at him. "That is a remarkably forward assessment of a stranger." "I'm a forward sort of man," he said simply, and the frankness of it disarmed her more than any charm would have. Her name was Nora Callahan. She told him so. And then, because the $4.32 felt like it was burning a hole directly through her carpetbag and into her conscience, she asked him what sort of job he had in mind. Jedediah Mercer was 30 years old. He had built the Mercer Ranch from 40 acres of hard Oklahoma territory he had purchased at 19 with every cent he had earned as a trail hand, and had since expanded it to nearly 2,000 acres of New Mexico rangeland. He ran cattle, maintained a small horse operation, and employed 7 men full-time. He was, by Dusthaven's modest standards, successful. He was also, by most of Dusthaven's observation, thoroughly lonely, though he would have denied it with considerable conviction. His daughter was 5 years old. Her name was Clara, and she had come into the world in the same terrible hour that her mother had left it. Eleanor Mercer had been a gentle woman from Tennessee who had loved wildflowers and could play the piano with a beauty that made grown cowboys set down their coffee cups and go quiet. She had died of complications following Clara's birth, and Jedediah had buried her beneath the cottonwood tree at the eastern edge of his property, and had not spoken her name aloud for nearly 3 years. Clara was a fierce and imaginative child who had, in the past 6 months, worked through 3 different women hired to mind her, not because she was cruel, but because she was relentless. She asked questions that grown adults could not answer. She climbed things that were not meant to be climbed. She had once attempted to teach the ranch's border collie to count using stones arranged in a line on the porch, and when the dog proved uninterested, she had simply moved on to trying to teach it to fetch specific objects by name. Jedediah adored her completely and was also, he would admit to himself in the dark of the night, absolutely overwhelmed by her. The last woman he had hired to mind Clara had quit after 2 weeks, citing exhaustion and a specific incident involving a mud puddle, a saddle, and what she described only as an inexplicable quantity of frogs. He had ridden into Dusthaven that morning to check the stage arrivals and post a new notice on the board outside the general store. He had not expected to nearly knock a woman flat on her face outside the boarding house, but he had learned long ago that the territory rarely offered what you expected. He explained the situation to Nora Callahan with the same directness he applied to everything. He had a daughter who needed minding and teaching 5 days a week, sometimes more during cattle drives. He could offer room and board in the main house, meals included, and a fair wage of $12 a month. The arrangement would last through the winter, he said. After that, well, they could revisit the situation in spring. Temporary, he said, and there was something in the way he said the word that told her he used it deliberately, that he preferred his arrangements to have clean, foreseeable edges. Nora thought about $4.32. She thought about the boarding house behind her and what a room would cost per week. She thought about the dead debts she had outrun and the new life she had come here to construct. "I'll take it," she said, "but I want to meet the child first." He took her out to the ranch that same afternoon in his wagon, and when they arrived, Clara Mercer was sitting on the top rail of the paddock fence, arms spread wide for balance, reciting the names of the states of the Union to the horses below. "There are 38 of them now," Clara announced to no one in particular, "and I can name every single one." Nora set down her carpetbag. "Can you name them in alphabetical order?" Clara turned around, and her dark eyes, exact copies of her father's, fixed on Nora with immediate interest. "I don't know what alphabetical means," she said without the slightest trace of embarrassment. "It means in the order of the alphabet, a before B, B before C, like a system." Clara considered this with profound seriousness. "Can you teach me?" "That's rather the idea," Nora said. Clara looked at her father, then she looked back at Nora. Then she climbed down from the fence with the agility of a small cat and held out her hand for shaking. "I'm Clara Mercer. I'm 5 years old in 3 months. The 3 months matter." Nora shook her hand with complete formality. "They absolutely do." "I'm Nora Callahan. I'm 26 years old." "Do your months matter?" Clara asked. 7 months, Nora said. "I'm 26 years old in 7 months. Clara beamed. "Jed says you're going to mind me." "Jed?" Nora glanced at the man standing behind her daughter. He had a look on his face she could not quite interpret, something that was trying not to be fond. "She won't call me father, says it sounds too formal." "It does," Clara confirmed, then grabbed Nora's hand and began pulling her toward the house to show her something she referred to only as the thing I made, which turned out to be an extremely ambitious, if structurally questionable, miniature house constructed from sticks, mud, clay, and what appeared to be an entire season's worth of acorn caps. That was the beginning. The Mercer Ranch house was larger than Nora had expected. It was built of adobe and timber, 2 stories with a covered front porch that wrapped around 2 sides, a kitchen that had real iron stove and a pump that brought water up from a cistern, and a parlor with a stone fireplace that could have roasted an entire side of beef. The house had the particular quality of a space maintained by someone who valued function over comfort, everything clean and orderly, but bare of the small touches that make a house a home. No curtains. No flowers, dried or fresh. The shelves held tools and ledger books and a single Bible, but nothing decorative. Nora did not comment on this. It was not her house, and she was not here to redecorate. She was here for Clara. Her room was on the second floor, small but private, with a window that looked out over the east pasture toward the distant line of the mountains. It had a bed with a real feather mattress, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. She unpacked her carpetbag with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had learned not to take space for granted and went downstairs to start supper. Jedediah was in the kitchen ahead of her, attempting to do something with a salt pork and a collection of root vegetables that suggested a man who could keep cattle alive across 500 miles but had a more uncertain relationship with the culinary arts. "I'll do that," Nora said. "I can manage," he said. "I'm certain you can," she said politely, and took the knife from his hand anyway. He stared at her for a moment, then apparently decided that this was not a battle worth engaging, because he stepped back, leaned against the doorframe, and watched her work. She made a proper stew with the salt pork and the vegetables, found a tin of cornmeal on the shelf and made a skillet of cornbread, and set the whole thing on the table with a neatness that seemed to briefly silence Jedediah Mercer in a way that impressed her. "You've done this before," he said. "I kept house for 6 years," she said. "I know my way around a kitchen." Clara ate with tremendous enthusiasm and talked without stopping, informing them both about the horses by name and personality, about a bird she had seen that morning that she was confident was a type she had never seen before and needed identifying, and about her firm belief that the dog had in fact been making progress on learning to fetch by name before the frog incident had caused a disruption. "What was the frog incident?" Nora asked. Clara looked at her father. Jedediah looked at the ceiling. "A lot of frogs got inside the house," Clara said carefully. "How many frogs?" A pause. "More than 10. "Considerably more than 10, Jedediah said to the ceiling. Nora pressed her lips together against a smile. "I see. And how did they get in?" Clara arranged her expression into one of deep innocence. "I am not entirely sure." Nora decided this was sufficient answer for the time being and let the matter rest, but she caught Jedediah's eye across the table, and there was something there, a shared flicker of amusement, brief and unguarded, like a window opened for just a second before being closed again. It was so fleeting she almost missed it. She did not miss it. The first 2 weeks settled into a rhythm with surprising smoothness. Nora woke each morning before dawn, had the stove going and coffee ready before the ranch hands arrived for their early duties, and had Clara washed and breakfasted and seated at the kitchen table for lessons by 7. She had brought with her a McGuffey reader, a primer, and a slim volume of geography, and she supplemented these with everything the ranch itself offered, counting cattle for arithmetic, learning compass directions from the mountains, identifying plants and birds for natural history. Clara was, as Jedediah had suggested in the most understated possible way, extraordinary. Her mind moved like water, finding the quickest path around every obstacle. She had already taught herself to read simple words from a cattleman's almanac she had found somewhere and claimed as her own. With a proper teacher, she exploded forward. By the end of the first week, she could name all 38 states alphabetically. By the end of the second, she was adding 2-digit numbers without counting on her fingers, and had memorized the names of 7 major rivers and which direction they ran. Jedediah watched all of this with a quiet attentiveness that Nora noticed, but did not draw attention to. He would sometimes find a reason to be near the kitchen window during the morning lessons, lingering over a piece of harness or a ledger that did not strictly require his presence there. She did not comment on it. She understood, she thought, what it was. He was watching his daughter thrive, and it was something he needed to witness. On a Friday afternoon at the end of her third week, Nora was in the kitchen making bread, and Jedediah came in to refill the water jug, and he stopped in the doorway and said without preamble, "She's different with you than she was with the others." Nora pressed her hands into the dough. "How so?" "Calmer," he said, "not less herself. But like she trusts the ground under her feet." Nora considered that. "She's very bright, she needs to be challenged. When a child that bright isn't challenged, they find their own challenges, and those aren't always the ones the adults around them would choose." He was quiet for a moment. "The frogs," he said, "among other things, I suspect." He set the water jug down and leaned his hands on the counter and looked at her for a long moment. "You were a teacher before, in Kansas City." She had not told him she was from Kansas City. She had mentioned Kansas only generally. She realized he had asked around. The thought did not entirely displease her, though she was not sure what to make of it. "No," she said, "I was a wife, but I had 2 years of schooling at a female seminary in Ohio before my marriage, and I did some teaching of neighborhood children informally, nothing official." "You're better than the school teacher we had in town last year," he said. "What happened to the school teacher?" "He was afraid of snakes. They're fairly common here. He lasted until the first rattlesnake in the yard incident and took the next stage east." "I'm not afraid of snakes," Nora said. "No," Jedediah said, and there was something in the word that held a different weight, as though he were noting something about her that extended beyond reptiles. "I didn't think you would be." He took his water jug and went back out. Nora stood with her hands in the bread dough for a moment longer than strictly necessary. November arrived, and with it the first cold, and the first cattle drive of the season, bringing steers down from the high pasture to the lower winter range. Jedediah was gone for 4 days. He left before dawn, spoke briefly to his foreman, a weathered man named Hank Pulliam who had been with the Mercer operation since the beginning, and then came into the kitchen where Nora was packing trail food into saddlebags, and told her that Hank would check in daily, and that she had full authority over the house while he was away. "I know," she said, tying off the last saddlebag. "We'll be fine." He stood in the kitchen doorway, hat in hand, and looked at her, and then looked at Clara, who had appeared at the foot of the stairs in her nightgown because she had heard the preparations and woken herself up. "You'll be back Thursday?" Nora asked. "Wednesday night if the drive goes clean," he said. Then he went to Clara, crouched down to her level, and said something low enough that Nora could not hear it. Clara put both arms around his neck and squeezed with complete dedication. He hugged her back, close and careful. Nora looked away. It felt private. He was back Wednesday night, as promised, arriving just as Nora was pulling supper off the stove. He came in with the smell of wood smoke and trail dust, and his coat still carrying the cold of the evening, and he stopped at the sight of the kitchen, which was warm and lit and smelled of roast chicken and onions. Clara launched herself at him from the second stair, and he caught her and held her up while she delivered a comprehensive report on everything that had happened in his absence, including a detailed account of how she had helped Nora make butter, that she had learned to write the letter Q, which she described as the most difficult letter by a substantial margin, and that the border collie had successfully fetched a specific stick 3 times in a row after a single afternoon of Nora's instruction. Jedediah looked at Nora over his daughter's head. "You taught the dog." "I taught Clara to teach the dog. It's different." He set Clara down and sat at the table and ate 2 full bowls of stew and most of the cornbread that was left, and said very little, in the way of a tired man who is exactly where he wants to be and is content to let that fact exist without requiring conversation to confirm it. Nora washed the dishes and listened to the quiet of the house and felt something she had not felt in 7 months, which was something close to peace. Then December came, and with December came Margaret Hollies. Margaret Hollies was the widow of a prosperous rancher from the northern part of the territory, perhaps 50 miles away, and she arrived in Dusthaven on a Saturday with a matched team of bays and a surrey that cost more than most men in the territory earned in a year. She was 43, well-dressed, handsome, and had been widowed for 14 months. She had also, as Nora learned from Mrs. Alvarez at the boarding house during a supply trip to town, been making pointed inquiries about Jedediah Mercer since before Nora's arrival. "She wants to marry him," Mrs. Alvarez said, with the candid directness of a woman who had heard everything through the walls of a boarding house. She's not shy about it either. Told Rebecca Crane at the seamstress shop that a man with a ranch that size shouldn't be raising a child alone. Said it's not proper. Nora felt something tighten in her chest that she told herself was indignation on Clara's behalf. Margaret Hollis came to the Mercer ranch on a Sunday afternoon with a basket of preserves and a warm smile, and the absolute self-possession of a woman who had never in her life doubted her welcome. Jedediah received her on the porch with the careful courtesy he applied to all visitors, and Nora watched from the parlor window while pretending to mend a shirt. Clara appeared beside her within 30 seconds. "Who is that?" she asked. "Mrs. Hollis. She's a neighbor, apparently." Clara studied the woman on the porch with an evaluating eye that belonged on someone twice her age. "She keeps touching Jed's arm," she observed. "It's polite to be friendly," Nora said with less conviction than she would have liked. Clara looked at Nora. Nora looked at the shirt she was mending. Clara went back to looking out the window. "I don't like her hat," Clara said finally. "You shouldn't judge people by their hats." "I'm not. I just don't like it." Jedediah invited Mrs. Hollis in for coffee because he was a man with manners, and Nora made the coffee and brought it to the parlor and was introduced as Miss Callahan, Clara's teacher, which was accurate and appropriate and also, for some reason she could not entirely justify, annoying. Margaret Hollis was perfectly pleasant to Nora. She admired the house, commented on how capable it must be to have good help, and gave Clara a stick of peppermint candy with the polished warmth of a woman practiced at making children like her. Clara accepted the candy with impeccable politeness, and then sat in the corner of the parlor and looked at Mrs. Hollis with an expression that Nora would later describe to no one as profoundly judicial. After Margaret Hollis left, Jedediah sat in the parlor for a long moment with his coffee cup, saying nothing. Clara had gone upstairs. The house was quiet. "She's going to keep coming," Nora said, carrying the coffee tray toward the kitchen. "Probably," he said. "Is that something you want?" He looked at her directly, and for a moment the directness of it was startling. "No," he said. Then, as if he had said too much, or perhaps not enough, he picked up his hat from the table and went outside. Nora stood in the kitchen and washed the coffee cups with very particular attention. She had not come to this ranch to feel things about Jedediah Mercer. She had come here with $4.32 and nowhere else to go, and this arrangement was temporary. He had said so himself. Temporary. Through the winter. Revisit in spring. She was a widow with debts and no prospects and a carpetbag for luggage, and he was a landowner with 2,000 acres and a daughter who needed stability. These were not the raw materials of any story she had a right to write herself into. She scrubbed the coffee cups. She was very thorough. December rolled on and Christmas approached, and the territory turned cold in the particular way of the Southwest. Not the killing cold of the northern plains, but a sharp, clean cold that had teeth in the night. Snow dusted the mountains, and the mornings were hard with frost, and the horses steamed in the paddock at dawn. Nora made Christmas preparations with careful, conscious focus. She had found bolts of red calico in the back of the supply room and made curtains for the kitchen and the parlor windows. Simple ones, nothing elaborate, but they changed the quality of the rooms immediately, and Jedediah came in one evening and stopped and looked at them for a long time without saying anything. "I should have asked permission," Nora said. "No," he said. He was still looking at the curtains. "They're good. She would have." He stopped. Nora waited. "Aliner would have put curtains up years ago," he said. It was the first time she had heard him say his late wife's name. He said it carefully, like someone testing ice. "Tell me about her," Nora said quietly. It was a risk. He might close like a door. He didn't. He sat down at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and talked, slowly at first, then with more ease, about a woman who had been warm and funny and who had hated dust but loved the territory anyway. who had brought her piano all the way from Tennessee tied to the back of a freight wagon, who had been reading a novel about French history when she had gone into labor and had been annoyed about it because she was only 50 pages from the end. Nora listened to all of it. She did not try to offer comfort or wisdom. She simply listened. And when he finished, she said, "She sounds like someone worth missing." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "she was." They sat in the kitchen with the new curtains and the stove heat and the coffee, and the silence between them was the kind that requires two people to build, quiet and warm and without edges. For Christmas, Nora made Clara a rag doll with button eyes and yarn hair and a calico dress that matched the kitchen curtains, and wrapped it in brown paper with a ribbon she had saved from a package. She had spent some of her wages on it and did not regret a penny. Clara opened it on Christmas morning with a reverence that she usually reserved for her most ambitious intellectual pursuits, and then held it against her chest and looked at Nora with dark eyes gone suddenly liquid. "Does she have a name?" Clara asked. "She's yours, you get to name her." Clara thought for approximately 4 seconds. "Eleanor," she said, "because that's a name that matters." Jedediah was standing in the doorway of the parlor. Nora saw his face when Clara said the name. She saw the way he had to look away for a moment, and the way, when he looked back, there was something in his expression that was grief and love and gratitude all tangled together in a way that made her throat ache. He had gotten Clara a pair of riding boots, proper ones, fitted by the cobbler in town, and a new primer with illustrations. He had also, Nora discovered when she came into the kitchen that morning, somehow acquired a small jar of horehound candy which had been, when she had mentioned it in passing 3 weeks earlier, her late mother's Christmas tradition. She had not expected him to remember. She had not expected him to do anything with it if he did. She stood in the kitchen looking at the small jar with its brown paper label, and Jedediah came in behind her. "The mercantile had it," he said with practiced ease as though it were a minor thing. "Figured it might make the day a little more like home." Nora Callahan, who had not cried in 7 months, had to spend a moment looking out the kitchen window at the frost on the pasture grass before she trusted herself to speak. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady, just barely. "Merry Christmas, Nora," he said. The first time he had used her first name, she turned around. He was close, closer than the kitchen usually required. He was looking at her in the same way he sometimes looked at the mountains, as though they were a thing he had accepted as permanent in his landscape. "Merry Christmas, Jedediah," she said. Neither of them moved for a moment that was 2 seconds and also somehow considerably longer. Then Clara came running and demanding breakfast, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary, beloved chaos of the morning. January brought snow, and the kind of weather that kept everyone close to the house, and with it came a new and pleasant intimacy born of proximity and routine. Jedediah was less able to avoid the house when the weather was bad, and so he was more often at the kitchen table with his ledgers while Nora taught Clara, and more often in the parlor in the evenings while Nora mended or read and Clara played with Eleanor the doll. He did not always talk, but he was there. They fell into conversation the way people do when they have dispensed with the formality of needing a reason. He told her about the ranch, about the politics of the territory, about the slow, difficult process of establishing water rights in the high country that was essential to expanding the herd. She told him about Ohio and about her seminary years, and about the books she had loved and about her parents, both gone now, and about her marriage to Patrick, which she described honestly as a thing that had been neither very bad nor very good, simply chosen too quickly by a girl who had not known herself well enough yet to choose wisely. He listened with his full attention. Jedediah Mercer was not a man who pretended to listen while thinking of other things. When he was with you, he was entirely with you, and the experience of that focused attention was something Nora had not encountered often enough in her life to have become accustomed to it. "Do you regret it?" he asked one evening. "Marrying him," she thought about it honestly. "I regret that he was not who I imagined he was," she said, "but I was not who I imagined I was either, We were two strangers making promises neither of us had the experience to keep. I don't think regret is the right word. I think the right word is something more like grief for an idea. He was quiet for a while. Then, Alina and I were different. We knew each other for 3 years before we married. Knew each other's habits and faults and all the ordinary things. I thought that meant we had more time coming to us than we got. "I'm sorry," Nora said, and she meant it in the deepest possible way. He looked at the fire. "The hardest part isn't the missing," he said. "The hardest part is that Clara doesn't remember her. She was 3 weeks old when Alina died. She never had the chance to know her mother, and I can't give that to her no matter how much I want to." Nora did not have an answer for that. There was no answer. She simply stayed in the silence with him, and he seemed to understand that this was what was needed, because after a while his shoulders eased and he looked at her and gave a small, grateful nod that said more than words would have. February. The snow was deep and the cattle were managed and the days were short and the house was warm, and something had shifted between them so gradually that neither of them could have identified the exact moment it happened. It was like watching snow accumulate. You could not point to the flake that made the difference, but the difference was there. He had begun coming home from the pasture at noon instead of midday, joining Nora and Clara for dinner, a thing he had never done in the early weeks. He had helped without being asked, to fix the loose board on the second stair that Nora had been carefully stepping over for 6 weeks. He had ridden into town on a Tuesday morning and come back with a wrapped parcel that he set on her workbench without comment, and which turned out to contain 3 spools of good quality thread in colors she had mentioned needing, and a novel by Thomas Hardy that she had said, once, in passing, she had always wanted to read. She had looked at the novel and then looked at him and said, "You remembered that." "I remember most things," he said, as though this were ordinary. As though bringing her Thomas Hardy was the kind of thing a man did for a woman he had hired on a temporary basis to mind his child. It was not ordinary. They both knew it was not ordinary. Neither of them said so. Hank Pulliam, who had survived 20 years in the territory on the strength of saying exactly as much as was necessary and not one word more, said to Jedediah one cold Tuesday morning while they were checking the fence line, "You ever think about the spring?" Jedediah kept his eyes on the fence wire. "What about the spring?" "You told her through the winter," Hank said. "Winter's ending." "I know when winter ends, Hank." "Just making sure," Hank said. He went back to checking the fence wire. That evening, Jedediah came in late and found Nora alone in the kitchen, because Clara had been put to bed early with a slight cold. She was at the table with her mending and the Hardy novel propped against the sugar bowl and the lamp turned up bright. She had her hair down, which was unusual. She was always careful to have it pinned. But it was late, and she had thought he was in the bunkhouse for the evening. It was down around her shoulders, dark brown, and the lamplight was doing things to it. He stood in the kitchen doorway longer than was required to simply enter a kitchen. She looked up and immediately reached for the pins. "Don't," he said. The word came out more directly than he intended. She looked at him, her hands stilled. "It's late," he said, trying to recover some ground. "There's no need on my account." She lowered her hand slowly. It was a very quiet decision. He sat down across from her and she pushed the novel aside and they sat without the specific armor of occupation, without mending or ledgers between them, and it was different in a way they were both aware of, and the awareness sat in the air between them like something waiting to be named. "Hank mentioned the spring," he said at last. She folded her hands on the table. Her expression was careful. "Hank is observant. He is. It's occasionally annoying." He looked at his hands. "The arrangement I offered you was through the winter." "Yes," she said. "Winter's ending." "Yes," she said. A long pause. The fire in the stove settled. Outside, the wind went by. "I don't want to revisit it," he said. "I want you to stay properly, not just on a temporary basis. Not just for Clara, though she needs you, but I want you to stay because—" He stopped. He looked at her, and the man who was always certain of what he meant to say did not seem to know exactly how to finish. "Because," she prompted quietly. "Because I have not looked forward to coming in from the pasture in years," he said. "And now I do, every day." And it's because of what's inside the house. Nora looked at him for a long time. She was not a woman who made decisions without thinking. She had made one fast decision in her life, and it had been to marry Patrick Callahan, and it had taught her caution. But she also knew the difference between caution and fear, and what she was feeling right now was not caution. "Jedediah," she said, "the way you've just described it coming home to the house, that sounds like something more than wanting a governess." He met her eyes. "Yes," he said, "it is." "Then say what it is." He leaned forward across the table, and his hand came to rest on the table near hers, not on it but near it, close enough that she could feel the warmth. "I would like to court you," he said, "properly, if you'd allow it." Nora Callahan had not expected to say yes. She had come to Dusthaven to rebuild, not to fall into anything. She had told herself very clearly that the arrangement was temporary, and that she would exit it cleanly in the spring with her wages and her composure and a plan. But plans were made by the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in September, and she was not entirely that woman anymore. Something in her had been remade, quietly and incrementally, over these months of bread and lessons and Christmas morning, and Thomas Hardy and firelight conversations about grief. She had been remade by the particular gravity of this man and his fierce small daughter and this house on the edge of the territory. "Yes," she said, "if you do it properly." "I intend to," he said, and when he smiled, the full and true version of it that she had never quite seen before, she understood that this was the kind of thing a woman could spend a long time looking at and not grow tired. March arrived with mud and new grass and the first wildflowers on the south-facing slopes, and Jedediah Mercer courted Nora Callahan in the forthright and earnest manner of a man who had decided what he wanted and was going after it without the unnecessary complication of pretense. He took her riding on Saturday afternoons, just the two of them, while Hank's wife, Dora, came to sit with Clara. He showed her the ranch, all of it, the high pasture and the creek and the cottonwood under which Alina was buried, and he stopped there without ceremony and said, "I wanted you to know where she is. I wanted you to see it." Nora stood at the foot of the grave with its simple wooden marker and felt the weight of the history she was, perhaps, being invited to step into. "She was loved," she said. "Yes," he said, "and she would have wanted Clara loved. I believe she would have been glad of you." He said it simply, not to persuade her. Simply because it was true, and he was not a man who kept true things from people who deserved to know them. They rode back as the sun was going down and the sky was all orange and pink over the mountains, and at some point during that ride, their horses came close enough together that her knee was almost touching his, and neither of them moved away. He took her to the spring sociable in Dusthaven in early April, and the town noticed. Dusthaven was small enough that an event of this kind was noted by every person within it within approximately 48 hours. Mrs. Crane at the seamstress shop smiled at Nora with the particular warmth of someone who had been hoping for this. Mrs. Alvarez, encountered at the mercantile, patted Nora's hand and said something in Spanish that Nora did not understand but suspected from the tone was approving. Margaret Holly saw them arrive at the sociable together and made her assessment in a single glance, and thereafter redirected her considerable social energies toward the new freighting company owner from Albuquerque, which everyone considered an excellent outcome for all concerned. Clara, told carefully by her father that he was courting Nora and asked how she felt about this, thought about it for one moment and said, "I already knew," and then went back to trying to get the border collie to understand the concept of fetch by category. The letter arrived in April, forwarded from Kansas City through 2 intermediary post offices, and ultimately delivered to the Dusthaven post office, where it sat for a week before Nora collected it on a supply trip. It was from a lawyer's office in Kansas City. It informed her that 2 of Patrick Callahan's creditors, having failed to recover their full amounts from the sale of his assets, were now making a legal claim against the estate, including any property belonging to the widow. She sat in the wagon outside the post office and read the letter twice. She had nothing to take. She had no property. She was employed on someone else's land with her wages in a tin box under her bed and a carpet bag full of clothes. There was nothing for creditors to claim, but the letter was threatening in its language, suggesting she might be compelled to appear and testify, and the travel cost alone would be beyond her means, and the idea of returning to Kansas City was a stone in her stomach. She was quiet on the ride home. Jedediah noticed. He was exceptionally good at noticing, which was one of the things she had come to rely on without meaning to. "What's in the letter?" he asked. She told him, all of it. Patrick's debts, the creditors, the legal threat, the reason she had fled Kansas City in the first place. She had not told him the full extent of it before. She had told him she was a widow and had mentioned debt in the general sense, but she had not laid out the specifics because she had been ashamed, not of what she had done. She had done nothing wrong, but of the situation itself, the vulnerability it represented. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the ranch road was visible ahead of them, and he said, "Is there anything in that letter that is actually your legal obligation? Or are they hoping you don't know the law well enough to push back?" She stared at him. "I hadn't thought of it in those terms. Married women in most territories aren't legally responsible for their husbands' debts contracted independently," he said. "Kansas is the same. They might be testing you." "How do you know that?" "I had a boundary dispute with a neighboring rancher 3 years ago over water rights and learned considerable law in the process," he said. "I can write to my lawyer in Santa Fe. He can advise you." "Jedediah, that would cost money." "I'm aware of what lawyers cost," he said. "Let me help you." She looked at him and thought about the $4.32 and the distance she had traveled and the stubborn, necessary pride that had kept her upright through all of it. She thought about what it meant to let someone help. "I'll pay you back," she said, "from my wages." "You'll do no such thing," he said, and then seeing her expression, "It's not charity, it's practical. I have a stake in this being resolved." "Do you?" He looked at her directly. "You know I do." She looked at the road ahead. "All right," she said, "thank you." His lawyer's letter to the Kansas City creditors went out the following week, and the response that came back a month later was considerably more subdued in tone. The creditors, apparently, had indeed been testing her, and the specific and legally accurate response they received from a Santa Fe attorney had persuaded them to abandon that particular line of pursuit. The matter closed itself with a quiet finality that left Nora feeling lighter than she had in over a year. Spring deepened into May, and the territory came alive with the particular green that the desert produces after wet weather, the creosote sharp and clean on the air, the wildflowers rioting along the creek banks, and the evenings soft and warm enough to sit on the porch without a shawl. They had taken to sitting on the porch in the evenings, the three of them, Jedediah in his wide chair, Nora on the bench, Clara between them or on the steps. Sometimes Hank's wife Dora would come and sit, and they would all watch the stars appear over the mountains and talk about the small and important things of ordinary life. It was, Nora thought on a particular evening in May, the most precisely right thing she had experienced in a very long time. Clara had been watching them with the evaluative patience of a 5-year-old who is older in some ways than her years. She had asked Nora, one morning while they were doing lessons, if Nora was going to stay forever, and Nora had said, very honestly, that she hoped so. Clara had nodded once, with finality, and written the number 47 in extremely neat figures on her slate, which was the arithmetic problem they had been working on, and said nothing else, but had seemed settled in a way she had not been before. Jedediah proposed on a Wednesday evening in late May. He did not make a production of it. He was not that kind of man, and she was not that kind of woman. He waited until Clara was in bed and came onto the porch where Nora was sitting in the warm dark watching the stars, and he sat down beside her close, and he took her hand in his, and he said, "I would like you to marry me, Nora, if that is something you want." She had known it was coming. She had known it in the way that you know sunrise is coming, not the exact minute but the certainty of it. She had been watching herself to see what she felt as it approached, and what she felt was not the nervousness of a woman making a decision under pressure, but something much quieter and more serious. The feeling of having found the right road and recognizing it. "I want it," she said. He let out a breath that told her he had been holding it. She turned her head to look at him, and he was looking at her with the full force of his attention, that particular quality of his that made you feel seen all the way through. "I love you," he said. "I want to be clear about that. This isn't about the ranch or Clara or any practical consideration, though all of those are real. I love you. I have been working up to saying it for some time, and I am saying it now because it is the truest thing I know." She put her free hand over their joined hands. "I love you," she said, which surprised me. But here we are. He kissed her for the first time on that porch in the starlit dark, with the mountains just visible at the horizon and the cattle quiet in the far pasture, and the border collie asleep on the steps. It was unhurried and warm and completely certain, the kind of kiss that is not asking anything but simply saying something that has been true for a while and now has words for it. They were married in Dusthaven in June of 1879, at the small white-painted church on the north end of Main Street. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Miles, a lean, energetic man who had come west from Pennsylvania for reasons he was vague about, and had apparently found his calling among the scattered communities of the New Mexico Territory. The entire town came, or near enough to it. Hank Pulliam and Dora Pulliam sat in the front pew. Mrs. Alvarez brought tamales that she placed on the reception table at the church hall with the authority of a woman who was not going to be asked permission. Mrs. Crane had made Nora a dress from cream-colored lawn she had ordered special, with tiny blue flowers embroidered at the cuffs, and it was the most beautiful thing Nora had worn in years. Clara Mercer wore her best dress and new boots, and carried a bunch of wildflowers she had picked herself from the creek bank before dawn, pressed into a slightly disheveled bouquet. She presented to Nora at the church door with tremendous solemnity and said, "I picked them before the dew was off so they'd last longer. I read that in the almanac." Nora accepted them with the gravity they deserved and carried them up the aisle. Jedediah Mercer, waiting at the front of that small church in a dark coat and a clean white shirt, and his best hat held in front of him, watched Nora Callahan walk toward him with his daughter's wildflowers in her hands and her dark hair pinned up and her chin lifted and her eyes steady and direct. And whatever reserve he kept about the display of feeling dissolved entirely, because the look on his face was the kind that people in churches remember and talk about years later. The vows they exchanged were traditional: love, honor, and care. He said them as though he meant every word because he did. She said them back and meant them just as completely. They went home to the ranch in the evening, husband and wife, with Clara sitting between them on the wagon seat, leaning against Nora's side and half asleep before they reached the ranch gate, holding her wildflower bouquet in one hand and a leaner-the-rag doll in the other. Jedediah lifted Clara from the wagon and carried her upstairs and put her to bed without waking her, and when he came back downstairs Nora was in the kitchen, and the house was theirs, and the evening was warm and lit by lamplight, and neither of them needed to say anything immediately because the thing they had built between them, this life, this home, this permanent arrangement that had begun as a temporary one, was real and complete and sufficient. Summer on the Mercer Ranch was an education in a different kind of plenty. The cattle operation expanded in July when Jedediah closed a deal for an additional 500 head, and the high summer pastures required constant management. Nora took over the books, applying the precision she had learned at the seminary to the operations ledgers, and found with some satisfaction 2 accounting errors that had been accumulating for 3 years and corrected them, saving the ranch a not insignificant amount when taxes were calculated in August. Jedediah looked at the corrected ledgers and then looked at his wife and said, "Why didn't you tell me you could do this?" "You didn't ask," she said. "You hired me to mind your daughter." "I want it to be clear," he said. that marrying you may be the most sensible business decision I have ever made, in addition to every other reason." "It may well be," she agreed pleasantly, and went back to the ledgers. Clara turned 6 in August with a party that included every child from the 3 nearest ranches, and a cake that Nora made with real vanilla and dried cherries, and frosted with sugared cream. It was the most elaborate birthday Clara had ever had, and she received it with the particular joy of a child who has, at some earlier point in her life, learned to recognize and value a good thing when it arrives. That fall, as the cottonwoods went gold along the creek, and the first cold came back into the mornings, Nora began to suspect that the family was about to increase in number. She told Jedediah on a Sunday morning in October. He was at the kitchen table with his coffee, and she set a second cup down and sat across from him and said, "I believe we're going to have a baby in the spring." He set his coffee cup down with great care, as though sudden movements were inadvisable. He looked at her. The expression on his face moved through several things in rapid succession: wonder, and then a shadow of something she recognized as fear, and she understood why the fear was there, because the last time a child had been on the way in this house, it had ended with a grave beneath a cottonwood tree. She reached across the table and took his hand. "I know," she said. "I know what you're thinking. The last time," he started, "was different," she said. "The territory has a proper doctor now. Dr. Hendricks in Dusthaven attended 3 births last year without complication. I am healthy, Jedediah. I am not frightened." "I am," he said with the kind of honesty that only very few people achieve, the willingness to simply say the true and unflattering thing. "I know," she said, "and that's all right. But I need you to let me be glad of this, and I need you to try to be glad too." He turned his hand over and held hers. He worked on it visibly for a moment, the way a man works on something he means to do, and then he said, "I am glad. I am also terrified. Both of those things are true at once." "Good," she said. "That's probably about the right proportion." He stood up from the table and came around and pulled her to her feet and held her, carefully, with his arms around her in the way that meant he was not going to let anything happen to this, and she rested her forehead against his shoulder and let herself be held. Clara was informed that afternoon. She thought about it for approximately 10 seconds and then said, "Is it going to be a boy or a girl?" Upon being told that this was not yet known, she said, "I want a brother because there are already plenty of girls," a position she maintained with remarkable consistency over the following months, occasionally updating her request to include specific character qualities, including but not limited to good at climbing and not afraid of frogs. Winter settled in again, and this winter was different. The house was fuller in every sense. Nora was still teaching Clara, whose progress had accelerated to the point that Jedediah was beginning to talk about correspondence courses, because the local possibilities were going to be exhausted within a year or two. Nora was managing the books and the household and carrying a new life, and she was perhaps the most consistently content she had ever been in her existence, which she found both remarkable and entirely natural. Dr. Hendricks came out to the ranch in December and confirmed everything was progressing well and told Jedediah, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway during the examination with the expression of a man prepared to personally supervise the frontier of medicine, that he was entirely capable of handling a birth, and that the best thing a husband could do was stay out of the way when the time came. Jedediah said he understood. His expression suggested he had reservations. Christmas that year was entirely different from the previous one, and entirely better, which was saying something because the previous one had already been good. The house had Nora's curtains and the books she had acquired, and a piano that Jedediah had, with enormous logistical effort, managed to have brought out from Dusthaven on a freight wagon in November, because he had said one evening, quietly, "I don't want Clara to grow up not knowing what a piano sounds like in this house," and Nora had recognized this for what it was. She played carols on Christmas Eve while snow fell softly outside and Clara sat on the bench beside her and learned where to put her fingers, and Jedediah sat in the chair by the fire and watched with an expression of such complete peace that Nora felt it like warmth on her skin. Later, after Clara was in bed, Jedediah sat beside Nora on the piano bench and put his arm around her and said into her hair, "I didn't know it could be like this again." She leaned into him. "Like what?" "Full," he said, "the house full, the way it's supposed to be." She turned her face up to him, and he kissed her forehead and then her lips, and outside the snow came down on the Mercer ranch, and on the cottonwood tree and the mountains beyond, and the world was very large and they were very warm in the middle of it. The baby came in March of 1880, on a Tuesday morning that started ordinary and became extraordinary within a matter of hours. Jedediah rode to fetch Dr. Hendricks before first light, which meant a 4-mile ride in the dark and cold, and Dora Pulliam was there, having been sent for the previous evening when Nora's back had begun its preliminary announcements. The labor was long but not dangerous, and at 10:30 in the morning, in the bedroom with the window that looked out over the east pasture, a boy arrived. He came into the world with the specific enthusiasm of someone who had opinions about it immediately, and Nora held him and felt the particular wonder of it, the impossible smallness and completeness, the way he smelled like beginning. Jedediah was in the room at that moment, having completely disregarded Dr. Hendricks' advice about the staying out of the way part of things, and when the baby was placed in his arms for the first time, his face went through the same journey it had when she had told him the news in October. But this time the fear was faster and the wonder was longer, and what landed in his expression was an uncomplicated, profound joy. "Hello," he said to the baby, quietly, just that one word. Clara had been on the porch with Hank, under strict instructions to wait, and when Dora brought her up to the doorway and told her she could look, Clara stood in the doorway and looked at her brother with the most serious expression of her 6 years, and then said, "He's quite red." "Most babies are," Nora said. Clara considered him. "Is he going to stay that color?" "Absolutely not," said Dr. Hendricks, washing his hands at the basin. Clara appeared satisfied with this. She came to stand beside her father and looked at the baby he was holding and said, "What's his name?" Nora and Jedediah looked at each other across the baby's head. "Thomas," Nora said, "after my father." "Thomas Henry Mercer," Jedediah said, and his voice had the quality of someone who is reading something very important out loud for the first time. "Thomas," Clara repeated, trying it. She leaned forward and touched one of the baby's tiny fists with a single finger, and Thomas Henry Mercer, 4 hours old, wrapped his fingers around her finger with the grip that babies inexplicably have. Clara made a sound that Nora had never heard her make before, small and wondering. "He knows me," Clara said. "He does," Jedediah said. Clara looked at her father, and then at her stepmother, and then at the baby holding her finger, and something moved across her face that settled into something Nora recognized, because she had felt it herself. The sense of having arrived somewhere you had been moving toward without knowing it, of looking around at the shape of a life and finding it, at last, exactly right. Spring came fully into the territory, and Dusthaven began to change with it. The railroad had come through 30 miles to the south, and while it had not yet reached Dusthaven itself, it had changed the economics of the region in significant ways. Beef prices were up. Land values were moving. New settlers were arriving from the east, and with them, new businesses and the slow, complicated arrival of a more settled kind of civilization. Jedediah navigated all of this with the pragmatism of a man who had been in the territory long enough to understand that change was the only constant, and that the only question was whether you rode it or stood in its way. He had been among the first ranchers in the area to advocate for a proper road connection to the southern rail line, attending the territorial commissioner's office with Nora's carefully assembled petition signatures and a map she had drawn from Jedediah's surveys. The road was approved in August of 1880, and when the news came through, Dusthaven held a celebration in the main street with a bonfire and dancing. and Jedediah danced with Nora in the firelight while Hank held Thomas and Clara danced with Dora Pulliam, and the stars came out enormous overhead. He spun her in the old-fashioned way, the way people had danced on the frontier for generations, sure and warm, her skirts turning around them, and she laughed. A full and unguarded laugh that he had learned over the past year was one of his favorite sounds in the world. "We've done well," he said. "We have," she agreed. "I was thinking," he said. He always said this before something he had considered for a long time. She had learned to pay particular attention. "I was thinking we ought to build. The house is going to be too small. Thomas will need his own room before too long, and Clara's schooling is going to require a proper study space. And I've been thinking about adding a second barn if the herd expands as I expect it to next spring." "You've been thinking about all of this at once?" she asked. "I'm an efficient thinker," he said. "You are," she agreed. "Yes to all of it, especially the study for Clara. She's going to need a teacher by correspondence soon, and the dining room table isn't adequate. I'll talk to the builder in town next week. Make sure the kitchen gets a proper pantry," she said. "The current one is insufficient." "Noted." They danced until the bonfire burned low. The expansion of the house was undertaken in the spring of 1881, with a team of builders from Dusthaven who arrived in April and did not leave until September, by which time the Mercer Ranch house was a third larger than it had been, with a proper wing that included Clara's study, a room for Thomas that connected to the master bedroom via a small hallway, a proper pantry off the kitchen that Nora organized with a precision that bordered on the scientific, and a back porch that ran the full length of the new wing and looked out over the western pastures. Clara, now 7 and of very decided opinions, had been consulted on the design of her study and had requested a window seat. She got one, with storage underneath for her books. She filled it with everything she had accumulated in 2 years of serious learning: the McGuffey readers, the geography volume, 3 novels she had graduated to, a natural history text that had been mail-ordered from a publisher in Philadelphia, and an ongoing illustrated journal of local birds that she had been keeping since the previous spring. She was, everyone agreed, remarkable. The correspondence teacher they had found, a retired professor of mathematics and natural history from Santa Fe named Dr. Antonio Reyes, communicated with her by post twice a week and had written to Jedediah in June saying, with frank admiration, that she was the most advanced student of her age he had encountered in 30 years of teaching, and that he considered it his privilege to work with her. Jedediah read that letter 3 times. Then he went and found Nora in the kitchen and handed it to her without a word. She read it and looked up at him and smiled, and he smiled back, and there was in that shared smile the entire length and depth of what they had built together. Not just the ranch or the house or the expanded operation, but this child, thriving and becoming, who had needed space and challenge and love, and had gotten all 3. Thomas grew in the way that contented babies do, generously and without drama. He was a round and amiable creature who slept well, ate well, and observed the world around him with a calm interest that was so different from Clara's urgent intellectual intensity that Nora sometimes marveled that they had been born of the same father. He had her coloring, not Jedediah's dark eyes, but her own warm brown ones, and Jedediah was delighted by this in the particular way of a man who has been surrounded by his own reflection in his child's face and finds it fresh and wonderful to see someone else's. Thomas said his first word at 11 months, which was dog, directed with precision at the border collie, who had accepted the baby's existence with the professional equanimity of an animal that has survived frogs and now considers itself equal to most challenges. By the time Thomas was walking, Clara had appointed herself his primary educator, a role she took with complete seriousness. She would sit him in the grass and show him things, leaves and stones and birds, telling him their names with the patience of someone who understood that learning was built layer by layer. Nora watched this from the porch one September afternoon and felt something so large she had no single word for it. The word would have had to contain gratitude and love and wonder, and the specific joy of witnessing something whole. Jedediah appeared beside her on the porch, coming from the barn, and stopped to look at what she was watching. They stood together in the September light watching Clara teach Thomas the name of a yellow wildflower, and Jedediah put his arm around Nora's shoulders and she leaned into his side, and there was a long, comfortable silence in which both of them were doing nothing more complicated than being entirely present. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was not a question that cost him anything because he knew the answer. He asked it because he liked to hear it. "Yes," she said, simply and completely. "Are you?" "Extraordinarily," he said. He kissed the top of her head. "I've been thinking." "You have a lot of thoughts," she said. "I'm an active inner life," he said, and she could hear the warmth in it. "I was thinking about the arrangement." She looked up at him. He was looking at the children in the pasture and he was smiling. The original arrangement, the temporary one. The one that was going to last through the winter. "That one, do you remember what I said? Revisit in spring." She remembered every word of it. "I remember." "I never found a way to make it end," he said. "Every time I thought about it, there was no version that made sense, and then there was no version I wanted. And then there was no question at all, only this, only here." He looked down at her, and his eyes were warm and direct and entirely hers. "I think it simply turned into something that doesn't require an ending." Nora Callahan, who had arrived in Dusthaven with $4.32 and a dead husband's debts, and enough pride to walk straight into an unknown territory with her chin up, looked at the man she had married and the children they were watching in the golden September light, and felt the truth of what he had said land in her like something putting down roots. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't require an ending at all." He held her in the September sun and she let herself be held, and the ranch was all around them. The cattle and the horses and the mountains and the creek and the cottonwood, and the new wing of the house and the pantry she had organized, and the study with the window seat full of books, and all of it was the accumulated evidence of what happens when two people make one decision, and then, without quite meaning to, make it permanent. The years that followed the building of the new wing were good ones. Not without difficulty, because the territory was not without difficulty. There were hard winters and dry summers, and one terrible season in 1883, when a drought pushed the cattle operation to its limits and Jedediah and Hank. And every hand they had worked from before dawn until after dark for 2 months straight, and Nora kept the books and the household and her composure when the losses became evident, and sat with Jedediah at the kitchen table in the evenings while he worked through numbers and options, and she did not tell him what to do but was simply there. A steady presence in the lamplit kitchen, which was, she had come to understand, sometimes the most important thing anyone could offer. The drought broke in October with a 3-day rain that turned the pastures green again, and the herd recovered, and the operation stabilized, and in the spring of 1884 it expanded again, because Jedediah had used the hardest part of the previous year to negotiate the purchase of additional water rights that would make all future summers more manageable. "You planned that," Nora said, looking at the water rights agreement. "I planned it in November when it was most painful," he said, with the particular satisfaction of a man who plays a long game and doesn't mind saying so. "You are an occasionally maddening person," she said, with complete affection. "You married me," he pointed out. "I did," she agreed, "and I would do it again." He looked at her across the kitchen table with the ledgers between them and the evening coming on outside and said, "So would I without a moment's hesitation." Clara Mercer turned 10 in the summer of 1884, and at 10 she was a force of nature so thoroughly herself that it was difficult to imagine there had ever been a version of her that had not existed. She had, through the correspondence with Dr. Reyes, acquired Latin, intermediate mathematics, a deep and detailed knowledge of natural history, and the beginning of a genuine literary education. She wrote letters to Dr. Reyes that he had told Nora, in a note aside, he sometimes saved because they were better composed than most adult correspondence he received. She had also, with Jedediah's careful teaching over weekends and during cattle work, become a competent rider, comfortable on the trail, and she had a horse of her own, a calm bay gelding she called Euler after a mathematician she had read about in one of her books. The cowboys on the ranch, Hank included, had adopted her as a kind of honorary ranch hand, answering her questions about cattle with the seriousness she applied to everything, and she had repaid this by correctly identifying a herd illness the previous spring, a full day before the other hands had caught it, on the basis of behavioral observations she had recorded in her journal. Thomas was 4, and the most sociable creature on the property. He had opinions about everything, and none of them were complicated. He liked horses, and he liked biscuits, and he liked his sister in approximately that order, and he had a laugh that was, as Dora Pulliam once observed, something between a rooster and a celebration. At the end of the summer of 1884, Nora told Jedediah that Thomas was going to have a sibling. He received this information with considerably more ease than he had received it the first time, 4 years earlier. He was still moved by it. He was still careful in a way that told her he remembered. But the fear was a smaller part of the proportion than it had been before, and the joy came through cleanly. "Good," he said, and held her hand, and they stayed on the back porch in the summer evening watching the light go down over the western mountains. "Clara is going to want a girl this time," Nora said. "She'll want whatever it is," Jedediah said. "She'll teach it Latin before it can walk." "She might," Nora agreed. "She taught Thomas his numbers at 2 years old. I know, I saw her do it. She had him counting fence posts from the wagon." "She has a method," Nora said. "She has 5 methods," he said. "At least." Their second child, a girl, arrived in February of 1885 with Dr. Hendricks once again in attendance, and considerably less drama than Thomas's arrival, being a shorter and more direct labor that the doctor described as efficient, a word Nora appreciated greatly. The baby was small and dark-haired and serious-faced, as though she had come into the world with things already to think about. Clara, 9 years old and possessed of the authority that comes from having been right about things many times, stood at the bedside and looked at her sister with the expression she reserved for her very best discoveries. "What's her name?" she asked. Jedediah looked at Nora. "We discussed Rose," Nora said. "Rose Eleanor Mercer," Jedediah said. He said the Eleanor part quietly but directly, and Nora covered his hand with hers because she understood what it meant to give that name to something new. Not to replace, to honor, to carry forward. Clara said nothing for a moment. Then she reached out and touched the baby's dark hair with a finger and said softly, "Hello, Rose, I'm Clara. I'm going to teach you everything." Thomas, brought up by Hank, stood in the doorway looking at the baby with the evaluative uncertainty of a 4-year-old confronted with something smaller than himself for the first time. "Is it staying?" he asked. "Yes," Jedediah said. "She's staying." Thomas thought about this. Then he came and stood beside his father and looked at the baby and said, "She's very small." "You were too," Jedediah said. Thomas considered his own hands as though reassessing. "Did I have all my fingers right away?" "Every one," Nora said. He appeared reassured. He leaned against his father's arm and looked at his baby sister, and the family was all in that room, the 5 of them complete and warm and permanent. The years did not slow. They were full years, full of the particular texture of a life well occupied. The ranch grew, Clara grew, Thomas grew. Rose grew in her own time, slower and more deliberate than either of her siblings, with a quality of patience that seemed almost startling in a small child, a stillness that observed before it acted. She was not Thomas's rooster-laugh sociability, nor Clara's relentless intellectual forward momentum. She was her own thing entirely. She loved music the way Eleanor had, sitting beside Nora at the piano from the time she was old enough to reach the keys, listening with her whole body. The first time Jedediah heard Rose pick out a melody on her own, something she had heard Nora play, he stopped in the doorway of the parlor and stayed very still for a long time. Nora was not in the room, and Rose was alone at the piano, 3 years old, picking out notes with the serious concentration of someone doing important work. Jedediah stood in the doorway and felt the thing that grief does when it transforms slowly, over years of love and life and ordinary beauty, into something you can live with, into something that is simply part of the texture of who you are. He went and sat on the bench beside Rose, and she looked up at him with her mother's dark eyes and said, "I'm learning." "I can hear that," he said. "You sound wonderful." She turned back to the keys with satisfaction and went back to her melody, and he sat beside her and listened. And when Nora came in from the kitchen and saw them there, she leaned in the doorway for a moment before either of them noticed her, and she held the image of it, the man she loved and the daughter they had made together, at the piano that had come all the way from Tennessee tied to the back of a freight wagon. In the spring of 1889, the territory received word that New Mexico's statehood application was under consideration by Congress. It would take years more of political negotiation before it was resolved. The territory would not achieve statehood until 1912, but the discussion itself brought a new energy to Dusthaven and the surrounding communities, a sense of something building, of the frontier settling into something more permanent. Jedediah had been appointed to the County Land Commission that year, which required him to ride to the county seat twice a month. He took Nora with him when he could, and they would stay overnight at the hotel there and eat a meal that someone else had cooked and talk about the territory and the future and all of the things they talked about when they had uninterrupted time, which was not often with 3 children and a ranch. Clara, at 15, was the pride of everyone who knew her. She had, through her continuing correspondence education, completed a course of study that equaled a high school education, and was now working through university-level mathematics with Dr. Reyes, who had told Jedediah privately that she needed to go east for formal university education at some point, that a mind like hers deserved institutional resources. It was a conversation the family had been having in various forms, and it was not simple, because the thought of Clara leaving was not simple, and Clara herself was of complicated feelings on the subject. "I don't want to leave," she said one evening at supper, with the directness that had characterized her since the age of 5. "But I want to learn things I can't learn here, and I want to come back. I want to come back to the ranch." "Then that's what you'll do," Jedediah said. "You'll go and you'll learn and you'll come back. The ranch will be here." He looked at Nora when he said it, and she understood what he meant. The ranch would be here, and so would they, and Clara would always have somewhere to return to, which was the most important thing they had ever given her. The question of university was set aside for a few years yet, but it remained on the horizon, a good kind of future to plan toward. Thomas, 9 years old, had become his father's shadow in the way that sons sometimes become, following Jedediah on the cattle work, learning the land by being in it, absorbing the rhythm of the operation with a naturalness that made Jedediah quietly glad. He was not a scholar in Clara's mold, though he was bright enough in his own way. He was practical and curious and physical, happiest on horseback with the wind coming off the mountains. Rose continued her slow, deliberate flourishing. At 4 and 5 and 6, she lived largely in her own interior world, communicating its contents selectively, mostly through the piano and through a habit of drawing things in a small sketchbook Nora had given her. She drew horses and birds and mountains, and repeatedly, the cottonwood tree at the eastern edge of the property, which she found beautiful in all seasons. One autumn afternoon when Rose was 6, she came to Nora with the sketchbook and showed her a drawing of the cottonwood, and underneath it had written, in the careful letters of a child learning, "Eleanor." She could not yet spell it correctly, having written it without the capital, but she had found the word somewhere and used it for the tree. Nora held the sketchbook for a moment and then held it out to Jedediah, who read it and was quiet for a long time, and then set the book down and gathered Rose into his arms, and held her in the particular way he had of holding things that were precious, careful, and sure. "Yes," he said into her hair, "that's Eleanor's tree. That's a good name for it. The Mercer Ranch in 1890 was not the 40 acres that Jedediah had bought at 19 with everything he had. It was close to 4,000 acres of managed rangeland, a herd of several hundred head, a horse operation that sold well-regarded stock to buyers from 3 territories, a house that was full and lit and curtained and warm, a kitchen with a proper pantry, a study with a window seat full of books, a piano in the parlor, 3 children, 7 hands, and a border collie who had finally, definitively mastered fetch by category. Nora Callahan Mercer stood on the back porch on the last evening of that decade and watched the sun go down over the western mountains, which she had now watched do this from this exact porch for more than 10 years. She knew the mountains the way you know something you have looked at long enough for it to become part of your inner landscape, the particular way their peaks caught the last light, the way the shadow moved down their faces, the way the color changed from gold to rose to purple in the minutes before dark. Jedediah came and stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders, and they watched the mountains together. "I keep thinking," she said. "What do you keep thinking?" "About the stagecoach, September of 1878. I had $4.32 and I did not know a single person in the territory, and the plan was to start over. And," he said, "and I couldn't have imagined this," she said. "I could not have constructed this in my imagination if I had tried. It is so much more than I knew to hope for." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, I knocked you down outside a boarding house." "You caught me," she said. "There is a distinction." "I offered you a temporary job," he said, "through the winter. That was all I was thinking, something manageable, something with clean edges." She turned around to look at him. He was right there close, his eyes warm and dark in the last of the evening light, the face she had memorized over years and loved more for its familiarity. There were lines at the corners of his eyes now that had deepened with years of squinting into the sun. His hair had a thread or two of gray at the temple. He was 32 years old, and he was the most settled and certain thing she had ever known. "And then," she said. He put both hands on either side of her face, careful, the way he touched everything he valued. "And then I couldn't find the edge," he said. "I kept looking for the place where it was supposed to stop, and it just kept going. And then I didn't want to find it. And then I understood that some things don't have edges. They just go as far as the ground goes." She covered his hands with hers, holding them against her face, and looked at him in the last light of the day. "12 years ago I stepped off a stagecoach with no plan," she said. "And here we are." "Here we are," he said. He kissed her in the manner of a man who has kissed the same woman for 12 years and finds it no less worth doing. She kissed him back in the manner of a woman who arrived in a strange territory with $4.32 and no plan, and built everything good from that ground up. Behind them, through the back door that had been left open, they could hear the sounds of the house. Clara's voice, quick and certain, asking Thomas something about a mathematical principle she was trying to explain to him, and Thomas's response, good-natured and somewhat lost. The piano beginning, Rose picking out notes with growing confidence, a melody from something Nora had played that week, the sound of supper warming on the stove, the dog's claws on the kitchen floor, the ordinary, irreplaceable music of a life. Nora and Jedediah stood on the back porch in the dark that was coming on and held each other and listened to all of it, and neither of them said anything more, because there was nothing more that needed saying. The arrangement had been temporary. Neither of them had found a way to make it end. It had become, instead, the only permanent thing they had, and it was more than enough. It was everything. The mountains went dark and the stars came out, enormous and bright over the New Mexico territory. The same stars that had hung over the frontier for all the years before and would hang over it for all the years to come, indifferent to everything except the fact of being there. Night after night, steady and faithful, exactly where they were supposed to be. And inside the house the family went on, warm and lit and loud, as families do, as they would go on tomorrow and the day after, in all the seasons of the year still ahead of them. In this place they had made together, which had begun as a temporary arrangement and had ended as the best things do not at all.